I bought this iPad for about $55, and if I include the keyboard and the Apple Pencil, I ended up paying about 90. So, price of the same iPad, yet without any accessories. In other words, for this price, I have gotten an iPad which runs iPadOS 26 and has most of the distinctive features modern iPads have. Though, how did I manage to get it for this price? And how is it to use now, almost 6 years later? A few months ago, I stumbled upon a listing which, seemingly, advertised a 9.7-inch iPad with a dead battery, meaning that I could have expected something like a 2018 iPad in the best case scenario. Though one little thing caught my eye: smart keyboard connector, which means that the thing is either an early iPad Pro or a later budget iPad Air or a normal iPad. And clearly it's not an iPad Air, neither it is an iPad Pro, which means that the seller has probably incorrectly identified the iPad they had. And so, knowing that the iPad pictured is at worst a 2019 one, I clicked buy. It showed up exactly as shown in pictures: a nice condition 10.2-inch iPad, which does not turn on. Running a quick serial number check has revealed that it is indeed a 2019 iPad, but it is iCloud locked. Although it looked nearly mint, still clearly having its original display, judging by the lack of grayish tint cheap touchscreens have, I did not know whether said display and touchscreen are actually functional, as I have no way to test them without a working logic board. In hopes of being able to jumpstart the logic board without its battery, I started disassembling it, which is very tedious, as glass is extremely fragile and has to be thoroughly heated when being removed. I strongly advise against using any metal tools for this process, as you have a way higher chance of damaging either the touchscreen or the home button ribbon cable, not to mention that you can easily scratch the paint on the touchscreen or, even worse, the LCD itself. Plastic guitar picks are a decent choice here. I did also use a soldering station fan, heated to about 300-350 degrees Celsius in order to heat up the touchscreen, though you can use something like a basic hot air gun if you're careful enough. When I opened up the iPad, I was greeted with a swollen aftermarket battery, which I have ripped out of the case in hopes that, without it, the iPad would at least show the Apple logo when plugged in, confirming that at least the LCD still works. But that did not happen. I have seemingly taken a decent iPad with a dead battery and turned it into a pile of parts. Yet, there is one advantage in this case: you do not have to disassemble anything further in order to use this iPad as a donor. $35 later, and I have a smashed 2020 or 8th generation iPad, which, importantly, has an unlocked, functional logic board and a working battery. Even though it is 1 year newer than the 2019 iPad which I previously bought, all parts between the two should be cross-compatible, and on top of that, we are getting a CPU which is 2 times faster, uses relatively modern Bionic architecture, supports iPadOS 26, and most importantly, boards in this iPad do not tend to fail as much as 2019's did. Now, I could have theoretically bought a new battery, asked the seller to remove the iPad from their iCloud account, though chances are seller would not do that. And if the logic board is completely fine, which we cannot test without the battery, I would have had a working iPad. Yet, considering the amount of ifs in this case, I have decided to simply buy a donor, which would work nearly certainly in this case. Not to mention that for the price, I have supposedly gotten a lot more parts than I would have gotten had I bought them all individually. Everything was looking good initially, but I could not get the iPad to activate. When I tried mirroring the display, I was greeted with an MDM lock, not mentioned by the seller and something I cannot check as a buyer, even when I have the serial number of the device. Thankfully, it is fairly straightforward to bypass, and after you do that, you have a fully working device, as there are no iCloud or baseband locks. But fair to say, that was a letdown. The battery is also tired, having 1200 cycles and being at about 75% of its original capacity. Having no other options, I started taking apart this iPad, making sure to carefully tape the touchscreen as I do not want glass shards flying towards my face when opening the iPad up. And later on, I have loosely attached both display and touchscreen from the iPad I have originally bought, confirming that both, thankfully, still work. And now, confirming that, although without nuances, all of the parts needed work, I started assembling everything together. The most tedious part was removing the whole button from the shattered touchscreen, as if it gets broken, the iPad will lose Touch ID forever, as each button is paired to the logic board it was shipped with. Thankfully, this part went well, and so after taking it down to the touchscreen, I began the reassembly, making sure to wipe as much dust and grime from the display and inner part of the touchscreen as possible. There was this one spot on display though, which did not fade away even after being wiped for quite some time. I continued my attempts to remove it, only to quickly realize that at this point I have partially removed the outer display coating, hence creating a big permanent stain on the display. To not make things even worse, I cooled it off there and started applying the glue across the edge of the casing, making sure that I have removed as much of the old glue from the surface as possible. After putting the touchscreen back on, I used some clamps on top of tissues to clamp the display down for a couple of hours so that it becomes properly glued in. At this point, it has been over a month since I did the repair, and throughout this time I was actively using this iPad. The main question is, how did my repair last? Well, unfortunately, quite a bit of dust did get under the touchscreen, meaning that I failed to seal it hermetically with glue. For that same reason, lots of used iPads, especially ones with fake touchscreens, have dust under the screen. Considering that the one I used here is indeed original, I honestly did not expect fit and finish issues, but they arose nevertheless, even though the touchscreen looks to be perfectly aligned with the case. Other than ugly looking camera glass install and the smudge I left on the display, which thankfully is barely noticeable when the touchscreen is in place, it works perfectly fine and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Though keep in mind that if you want to do a similar repair without any prior experience, well, I'm sorry to break it to you, but you probably have a huge chance of breaking some of the parts in the process, as even if you succeeded in the short run, some issues may arise in the future. So, if you want to learn tech repair, at first I highly suggest taking something that is at least relatively old and is worthless to you. Now, the second question is, how is this iPad to use now in 2026? After all, it is nearly 6 years old, uses an 80-year-old mobile processor, and is on the verge of losing software support. Well, not as bad as it sounds. Basics are fine. UI, although has lag, is still decently quick, apps like YouTube work perfectly fine, web browsing is also solid. Basically, most of the things you'd want to use an iPad for either way are fine in here, unless you start multitasking. At this point, both the CPU and measly 3 GB of RAM quickly remind you how old this iPad is. Basic multitasking, like having two apps open simultaneously, are still feasible, yet there is lag, and having multiple apps open at the same time is pretty much undoable. Experience in basic things is also noticeably improved thanks to the smart keyboard case, as fits the iPad nicely. It can also be used as a kickstand, and the keyboard itself is okay. Even though keys barely have any travel, and it is a bit cramped, they're decently tactile, and if you set the iPad up on the table, you get a perfectly usable tablet for word processing. It also offers a bit of a punch in gaming. New on phones AAA titles like Death Stranding obviously won't run, and it will struggle with some new releases, yet the only game I actually play on mobile devices, PUBG Mobile, runs fine on here. And if you set everything to the lowest settings and cap it to 60 FPS, it runs fine. Stutters may and will occur in some heavy fights if there are 30 players around you, but it is a solid experience otherwise. Unless you ignore the fact that most of the skins are just absent from the game due to a lack of storage. Now, only having 32 GB of storage is a huge limitation today, as in order to fit PUBG without some of its additional resources, I had to delete practically everything else. And with all of the basic apps downloaded, I usually only have a few gigabytes left to spare. Although I generally advise against buying any device with 32 GB of space in 2026, if you happen to buy a similar iPad, make sure that you only want to use it for one thing, either general usage or you want to play one game. Yet, one thing which I did quite like about this exact iPad is the fact that it has LTE. Although I found it too large for this use case, it can theoretically be used as a navigator in an old car, and overall it is very convenient when you can just take this tablet anywhere with cellular connection and continue working on something without having to interrupt to start a hotspot on your phone, often having to deal with connectivity issues and further draining the battery. One other feature which this iPad has is Apple Pencil support, meaning that you can turn it into a nice notebook, even though this often requires you to pay a subscription fee or to buy a good app. Frankly, this is a feature which I use any iPad for the most, and even in this case, when I have to use goofy first generation Apple Pencil, which is also very cheap now, it works perfectly fine. Another convenient feature which it offers, except for saving you the need to carry multiple notebooks at the same time, is iCloud synchronization between your other devices. You can open the same notes either on your phone or your laptop, which is super usable sometimes. In conclusion, was this iPad worth the price? And especially the hassle I had to go through to make it work? From a practical standpoint, probably no. But keep in mind that I'm a die-hard PC user, and the main reason I need an iPad in the first place is to simply take notes. And this 8th generation iPad is perfectly sufficient for that. Yes, battery inside of it may only last 2 to 3 hours of screen time. Yes, it is a bit slow. Yes, it has little space. And yes, in most cases I would suggest to simply buy something like a 9th generation iPad at the very least. But considering how much I learned about working on iPads through this project, and the fact that this turned out to be a pretty good deal financially, I am perfectly happy with it. And if you want to learn to repair tech, you can scout for similar deals and then train yourself by trying to fix these devices.